Welcome back, Highlanders, to Chapter 8 entitled Economic Fluctuations, Unemployment, and Inflation. And this is the second chapter in this section that we call Macroeconomic Accounting, because again, this is just about the measures that we use to gauge how well an economy is doing based on its levels of productivity and again, employment. So with that in mind, in this particular chapter, we're going to be talking about the business cycle and business cycle definitions. We're also going to take a look at some labor market definitions and some calculations within the labor market so you can see exactly what we mean by an unemployment rate. We're going to talk about the three types of unemployment, or three ways in which you can be without a job in our economy. And then we're going to talk about natural, actual, and full unemployment and how that relates to the business cycle. We'll also talk a little bit about potential output and how that relates to the business cycle. And then we're going to finish up talking about inflation, how to calculate it, what are some problems that inflation creates, and then what are the causes of inflation. And so that will round out this chapter and this section on macroeconomic accounting. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move forward and talk about those business cycles. So a business cycle just refers to the fluctuations in the general level of economic activity, and it is based on two measures or two variables, right? The first is changes in real GDP. That was that definition that we explored the last chapter, right? Remember, that is our measure of productivity and economy, right? It is the market value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country during a specific period. And the fact that we're calling it real GDP means that we have adjusted for those price changes. So with that in mind, that is one of the variables that we use when we're calculating out or exploring these business cycles. And then the other is the unemployment rate, which is one that we're going to define and calculate in this particular chapter. Right, so again, whether or not we are in an expansion or a recession, whether or not we're in the good times or the bad times, depends on what happens with real GDP and the unemployment rate. So let's go ahead and draw ourselves out of business cycle. I'm going to go ahead and exit the full view so we can use some different colors here. All right, so we're going to draw a graph. Starts out looking kind of like the graphs that we've drawn so far. Only this time, instead of measuring price and quantity as our variables, right, on the vertical axis, we're going to be looking at that real GDP. And on that horizontal axis, we're going to be measuring this across time. All right, so we're going to have a upward sloping trend line. And this trend line just refers to kind of the average growth of this country. So we're talking about the United States here. And for the United States, we got an average of about 2 to 3% per year in the U.S. Right, so if we're growing at 2 to 3% in the United States, again, that's an average of 2 to 3% per year. That does not mean that we grow at 2 to 3% every year. Some years we grow a little bit more, some years we grow a little bit less. So with that in mind, the way that the business cycle works is that we have these things called expansions, which are kind of the good times, or the upward part of that business cycle. And then we start to have these contractions, or if they're long enough, we call them recessions. It's kind of the downward part of the business cycle. And then you're going to see, again, some more expansions. Followed by some more recessions. And then expansions again. And so forth and so on. Right? So again, you're going to have some years that are better and some years that are worse. But the idea is that these years are going to fluctuate around that trend line. So that if you were to put your hand on either side of those business cycles and smash them together, what you come up with is that trend line. Right? So again, the economy moves up and down and up and down, but it moves up and down in such a way that over a long time period, right? Again, it grows on an average of about 2 to 3%. That's the United States' trend line. Every country's might be a little bit different. So what we're going to do now is we're going to toggle back and forth between this slide and the next slide and start to write in these definitions where they go on this business cycle graph. Right. So when it comes to business cycle definitions, right, the first one is an expansion. An expansion is characterized by growing GDP and declining unemployment. So our real GDP is going up while our unemployment is going down. Right, so again, when we're measuring unemployment, we're talking about the number of people who are looking for jobs but can't find them, right? So that number is going to be smaller when the economy is expanding or doing really well, right? So again, if we're going back to our other graph here, right, the expansionary time period is this blue period here when the economy seems to be going up. Right, so again, that's what we call an expansion, right? And the economy is going to keep on expanding until it gets to the height of that expansion phase. And the height of the expansion phase is referred to as the peak or the economic boom, right? So again, the peak is the very height or top of that expansion phase. It is as good as the economy is going to get for a while, right? So we go up here and we find that peak right here at the top, right? Now, after we reach the peak, the economy is going to start a downturn, and that downturn is called a contraction, and that is characterized by falling GDP and rising unemployment, right? So again, our real GDP is going down, so we're producing less as an economy, and then our unemployment is rising, meaning that there's more people out there who want to find jobs but can't find them. Right, so with that in mind, again, that downward part of the business cycle is what we call the contraction. Again, that's the economy doing worse than it was doing before, right? Now, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, if that contraction is long enough, right, and when I say long enough, I mean more than 2 quarters long, so 2 quarters or longer, so about 6 months or longer, then we start to call it a recession. And that contraction is going to keep on going down until it reaches the lowest point of that contraction phase, and that lowest point is called the trough, right? So again, when we get down here to this point here where the economy is about to turn upwards again, we call that the trough. And then we start to move back into an expansion until we get to another peak, and then back into a contraction until we get to another trough, and so forth and so on, right? So the economy moves in cycles. It goes up and it goes down. We know that it's going to go up and it's going to go down. In other words, we know that the economy is going to move in this cyclical fashion. What we have a hard time predicting is exactly when these cycles are going to occur, how long they're going to last, and how severe they're going to be. Right? So we as economists try to predict that, and we do a remarkably bad job at it. Right? Sometimes economists are just frustrated weathermen, right, because their predictions are even less accurate than what the weatherman predicts often enough. Right. All right. So again, that's what the graph looks like with those definitions written in. And again, make sure you understand what those definitions are as we're moving forward. Right. Again, expansion is growing GDP and declining unemployment. Oops. Let me go back. There you go. Expansion is growing GDP and declining unemployment. The peak or boom is the height of the expansion phase. A contraction is characterized by falling GDP and rising unemployment. And the trough is just the lowest point of the contraction phase. All right, so moving forward, here's some real data, right? This is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You can actually Google search just Fred graph, and you can start plugging in these numbers yourself if you want to analyze how real gross domestic product has changed over the years. But we're going from 1950 up till about 2019 here. And looking at this, you're seeing that GDP, again, seems to be kind of going up and down around that about 2.5% mark. Again, we're usually between about 2 and 3% in the United States when you average it out, right? So again, we're around that 2 to 3% trend line, right? You're going to see increases and decreases. Now, those gray bars there, those represent recessions. So we've had plenty of recessions in our economy, some more severe than others, right? The time period from about 2008 through 2009 here. So this time period here is known as the Great Recession because at least at the time of this recording, this has been considered the worst economic time period since the Great Depression, which was happening from about 1929 up through the mid-1940s. Right, but as you can see with all these gray bars, these indicate recessions, and you can see that with every one of these gray bars, you're going to see this down spike in real GDP. Right, for every gray bar, again, our real GDP is going to be falling. And you can see that all the way through time here, right? Again, that's one thing that characterizes a recession is that declining GDP, right? And again, there's different kinds of things that could trigger a recession. So the recession that happened here right after 2000, this was triggered by the terrorist attacks of 2001, that September 11th terrorist attacks, right? This recession here, again, was triggered by the housing collapse or the collapse of that housing market and financial sector due to some bad loans that were made. by those mortgage lenders, right? But then sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to have an event that triggers it, right? A recession could happen just as a natural downturn in the business cycle, right? So with that in mind, that's kind of what the business cycle looks like with regards to those changes in real GDP. Right. Sometimes it might be kind of hard to see looking at the line. So here is a bar chart that tells you the same thing. Again, you can see that real GDP going down or declining and becoming negative in terms of measuring as a percent change when you see those gray bars. Again, those gray bars are those recessions, and those recessions are when real GDP is declining. Right. All right. Again, if you're going to look at unemployment rates here, the higher the unemployment rate is, then the worse off the economy is doing. Again, if you look at those gray bars, you're going to see some pretty big spikes in unemployment. Again, if you're looking at that Great Recession time period in 2008 through 2009, you're going to see unemployment soar, getting as high as about 10%. Some people say it got as high as 11 or 12%. Again, if you're trying to compare that to other economic time periods, as you can see, there are some other recessions where unemployment got maybe as high or a little bit higher. But the greatest period of unemployment in this particular country, in the United States, was back during that Great Depression, again from 1929 up till the mid-1940s, where unemployment got as high as 25%, meaning 1 in every 4 people looking for a job could not find one. Right. The average unemployment in the United States is usually somewhere around 4 to 5%, so somewhere in between that range. Right. So again, during these recessions, the unemployment tends to be higher, but then during those expansionary periods, unemployment tends to be lower, or again, right around that 4 to 5% range. So with that in mind, that's kind of how the unemployment rate relates to these business cycles. So continue on with these business cycle definitions. The official definition for recession, as I mentioned earlier, is a decline in real GDP for 2 or more consecutive quarters, a quarter being defined as a 3-month period. So there's 12 months in the year, so if we divide the 12 months up into 4 equal quarters, then each quarter is 3 months long. If our real GDP has been declining for 2 or more quarters, or 6 months or longer, right, then you are going to be, you're going to have that time period labeled as a recession. So the joke is, like, when is the economy in a recession? Well, when the Bureau of Economic Analysis says we're in a recession, because real GDP has been going down for 2 consecutive quarters or longer. Now, that's a very scientific definition, so it's very easy to define things as recessions. A less scientific definition is our definition for depression, and that is just a prolonged and severe recession. Right, so again, recession is a decline in real GDP for 2 or more consecutive quarters. A depression is just a really long and bad recession. Some people wanted the Great Recession of that 2008-2009 period to be called a depression, but for the most part, again, we just call it the Great Recession, indicating that it was a bad recession, but not severe enough to cross over into what we would call a depression. There's actually been only one time period in the United States history that has been universally and ubiquitously labeled a depression, and that is that Great Depression, where the unemployment got as high as 25%. And again, the economy was down from about 1929 up to those mid-1940s. Right. So those are some business cycle definitions that you're going to need to know moving forward in this class. Right. Now let's go ahead and get into some labor market definitions, and these can be a little tricky, so make sure you are paying attention and listening to the video here as you're taking notes. So the first labor market definition we're going to talk about is employed. What does it mean to be employed in the eyes of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or how we calculate it? And the way that they calculate it is a person is employed if he or she has worked full or part-time, which means even just a few hours in the past week. Or if they haven't worked in the past week, it's only because they are on vacation or sick leave from a regular job. So again, that's a statistic that could be misinterpreted a lot. For example, when you hear that somebody is employed, again, according to the way we measure it, that means that they've just could have worked part-time, which means even a few hours in the past week, right? So it doesn't mean that a person is working as much as they like. There might be somebody out there who really wants a full-time job where they can work 30 or 40 hours a week, but they can only get odd jobs where they just work maybe a few hours at a temp agency. That person is still considered employed according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So again, our number of people that we consider employed might be higher than what we really think it should be if you're trying to ask whether or not people have all the work that they would like to have, right? So again, if you've worked at all in the past week, you are considered employed, again, assuming that that work has been recorded somewhere. Now, if you haven't worked at all in the past week, but it's only because you're on vacation or because you've called in sick from a regular job, then of course you are still considered employed, right? So again, there's people out there who are working just a few hours who would love to be working 40 hours a week who are considered employed. There's people out there who might just do some odd jobs around the neighborhood, like fixing fences. As long as they record that money that they're earning, then they are also still considered employed, even if they love to have a more regular job with a more steady paycheck. Right. And again, if you haven't worked in the last week or so, but you are, that's only because you're on vacation or sick leave, then you are also considered employed. Now, one the students tend to, again, get confused on is what counts as unemployed. So to be considered unemployed, a person must not have worked at all in the last week, so they're not currently employed, but, and this is the big part here, they must be actively seeking employment in the last 4 weeks, which means that they must be looking for a job, right? If they are not looking for a job, then they are not considered unemployed, even if they haven't been working, right? So again, a person to be considered unemployed must not have worked at all in the past week, but they also must be actively seeking employment. Again, if they haven't worked and they're not looking for a job, then they are not considered unemployed, right? They're not considered employed either, right? They're just not counted in the Bureau of Economic Analysis's labor statistics. Now, if the person hasn't been working and they haven't been seeking employment, but that's only because they are waiting to start or return to a job, then they could also be considered unemployed, right? So in other words, a person has not been working in the past week. They also have not been looking for work, but that's also because they got a job that's supposed to start in, say, 4 or 6 weeks or however long, right? So they're waiting to start that job, then they would be considered unemployed during that time period, right? So for example, when I graduated from Florida State, or sorry, when I graduated from West Virginia University, I was about to start my job at Florida State University. I graduated from West Virginia University like at the beginning of May, got my PhD. Wasn't starting my job at Florida State University until the end of June. So there was a time period there where I wasn't working, but also wasn't looking for work because I had a job lined up. I was just getting ready to start that job. And so during that time period, I would be considered unemployed. All right, now, those who do not have a job and again are not seeking employment are not considered unemployed, right? We actually have a special euphemism for people who have stopped looking for work, maybe because they've gotten so frustrated about not being able to find a job that they've just given up. And we call them discouraged workers. So a discouraged worker is somebody who would like to work, but doesn't have a job and gave up looking for a job just because, again, they've gotten so frustrated with the process, right? And again, those people are not considered unemployed. They are not counted in the Bureau of Economic Analysis's labor statistics, right? So what this means, again, is that this statistic might not mean what we think it means, and changes in the statistic might not mean what we think it means. For example, if you have a lot of people out there who would love to work and are looking for jobs, then you might have a higher unemployment rate. If some of these people can't find work, but then they just stop looking for jobs, they just stop trying, then that might actually make your unemployment rate go down and look like the economy is stronger than it really is. Again, the unemployment rate didn't go down because people were getting jobs. It was starting to go down because people were so frustrated that they stopped looking for jobs. That's how bad the economy is, right? And again, if that is the case, then that's going to again make the unemployment rate go down and look like the economy is getting stronger when in reality it isn't. Right. So again, make sure you understand what makes somebody employed. That means they've worked even a few hours in the past week, or if they haven't, it's only because they're on vacation or sick leave. And then know what makes somebody unemployed. That means that they haven't worked at all in the past week, but they are actively seeking employment, or if they're not, it's because they're only waiting to start or return to a regular job. Right. So with that in mind, again, how accurate are these statistics? Well, they're as accurate as they are, as people are honest, in terms of the fact that these statistics could be skewed by people who are, say, acting like they are seeking employment when really they're not. It's like, how do we know people are out there looking for jobs when we're trying to calculate the unemployment rate? We do things like call unemployment offices. And again, people who are collecting unemployment benefits and are trying to look for work as part of that process right, might tell the unemployment office that they're out there looking for work when in reality they're not. In order to help illustrate that, I have a short video clip here from the popular show Seinfeld. George Costanza, who's going to be the character about to burst through the door there, he is unemployed and he's collecting unemployment benefits, and he's been telling the unemployment office that he is out there looking for work, but what he's really been doing is just sitting at home all day, being a discouraged worker, and kind of making up stories to the unemployment office about about jobs that he is trying to get. He's going to try to use his friends here to act like the jobs that the owners of the companies at the jobs that he's trying to get, so he can keep collecting unemployment benefits without working or looking for work. Let's take a look at this clip.
Did anybody call here asking for Vartan Industries?
No, what happened to you?
All right, listen close. I was at the unemployment office, and I told them I was very close to getting a job with Vartan Industries, and I gave them your phone number. So now, when the phone rings, you have to answer, Vartan Industries.
I'm Vartan Industries?
Right.
What is that?
You're in latex.
Latex?
Right.
And what do I do with latex?
I don't know, you manufacture it.
Right here in this little apartment?
And what do I say about you?
You're considering hiring me for your latex salesman.
I'm going to hire you as my latex salesman?
Right.
I don't think so. Why would I do that?
Because I asked you to.
If you think I'm looking for someone to just sit at a desk, pushing papers around, you can forget it. Enough headaches just trying to manufacture this stuff. Vartan Industries. Kel Vartan speaking. May we help you?
Hey, what are you doing Friday night?
Friday night? Nothing. Now.
Okay, you want to come with me and see the baby?
No. Fasten your seatbelts. We're going to see the baby.
Come on, if you don't see the baby now, you're never going to see her.
All right, I'll go.
All right. Yellow. What delay industries?
No.
Now you're way off. Well, yeah, that's the right number, but this is an apartment.
No,
What?
stay
Yeah, no problem. No problem. How did you know who they wanted?
And you want to be my latex salesman.
All right, so in looking at that clip, we can see that George Costanza was trying to represent himself as somebody who was unemployed, somebody who was out there looking for work, when in reality he was probably more of a discouraged worker, somebody who was kind of sitting at home, not looking for work, but acting like he was so he could collect those unemployment benefits. So again, how accurate are these statistics? Well, again, they are as accurate as people are honest or competent, and that might not always be the case. Now, I do want to note that you could be somebody who is not working and not looking for work without necessarily being a discouraged worker. For example, if you are a full-time student who's so busy going to school that you are not holding down a job and not looking for work, then again, you're not considered employed or unemployed either, right? You're just not in that labor force, right? If you are somebody who is too disabled to work, so again, you don't have a job and you're not looking for work, then you're not considered employed or unemployed. You're just not in the labor force. You could be somebody who's already retired. So you're done working, right? You're kind of old and getting ready to kick back and smell the roses. So again, you're not working and not looking for work. So again, you're just not in that labor force. You're not employed or unemployed either. So again, there can be a lot of people who are not working and not looking for work. Again, some of those might be these discouraged workers who just gave up looking. And some of them might just be people who are in a different stage in their life to where they're not working or looking for work at this point in time. So with that in mind, here's a question. Which of the following would be classified as unemployed? Is it A, fathers who choose to stay at home with their preschool-age children? Is it B, retirees who are no longer working at a job? Is it C, students attending school full-time and are not looking for work? Or is it D, a 20-year-old looking for her first job? So again, if we go through these, you got to ask yourself which one of these people is not working but is looking for a job. So fathers who choose to stay at home with their preschool-age children, so stay-at-home moms or dads, right? These are individuals who are not working, but they're not looking for work either because they're so busy raising their children, right? Again, they wouldn't be considered employed or unemployed, even though they don't have a job. Retirees who are no longer working at a job, again, as long as they're not looking for another job, would not be considered employed or unemployed either, right? Because again, they're not looking for work. Students who are again attending school full-time and are not looking for work would also not be considered unemployed since they aren't looking for work. But a 20-year-old who is looking for her first job, maybe she's right out of college, right? This is somebody who would be considered unemployed at this point in time, right? So D is the answer you'd look for if you got a question like this on a quiz or exam. So moving forward, let's talk about some more labor market definitions, and these are going to involve some calculations. The first of which is the civilian labor force, and the civilian labor force is just the number of people age 16 or older, which is the people that, again, the Bureau of Economic Analysis cares about measuring, who are employed or unemployed. So it's the number of people age 16 or older who are employed or unemployed. So again, if we are calculating out the civilian labor force, it's going to look like this. I'm just going to abbreviate civilian there. So our civilian labor force is just equal to the employed plus the unemployed. Now again, to be considered in this definition, you have to be age 16 or older. You also have to be a civilian or a non-institutionalized individual. And what we mean by that is that people who are in the military aren't necessarily included in this particular calculation. People who are in prison or mental institutions might also not be included into this particular definition. The fourth of our labor market definitions is the labor force participation rate, and this is the percent of the population age 16 and over who is in the civilian labor force. Right? So again, it's the percent of population age 16 and over who is in the civilian labor force. Right. So with that in mind, if we were to calculate out this particular definition here, the labor force participation rate. I'll just abbreviate participation there, is equal to the civilian labor force that we just calculated earlier, or showed you how to calculate earlier, divided by the population that we care about measuring. So that's that population, again, 16 and over, and of course non-institutionalized. Right, so again, the civilian labor force divided by the population that we are measuring. Again, those are individuals who are 16 and over and non-institutionalized. Number 5 is the unemployment rate, and this is the percentage of people in the labor force who are unemployed. So it's the percentage of people, again, in the labor force who are unemployed. Right, so if we wanted to calculate that out, right, again, it's going to be the unemployment rate, and this is again what we're focusing on when we are figuring out those business cycles. That is equal to the number of people who are unemployed divided by the population, divided by the civilian labor force. That was calculated again in part 3 there, or number 3 of our labor market definitions. Now I almost made the mistake that I was about to warn you all about, and that is one of the most common mistakes made here for number 5 is that when you're calculating the unemployment rate, people often want to divide unemployed by the population 16 and over, because again, that's how you calculate the labor force participation rate. What makes this definition a little bit different is that you don't divide the number of people unemployed by the population, because we're not looking for the percentage of people in the population who don't have jobs but are looking. You want to divide the unemployed by the civilian labor force, because it's the percentage of the civilian labor force that we care about who are looking for jobs but can't find them. And then the final calculation is probably the easiest to remember because it's right there in the name. The employment to population ratio is just the percentage of population age 16 and over who are employed. Right, so again, if we're calculating the employment to population ratio, that is equal to the percent of the population age 16 and over who are employed, or again, just your number of people employed divided by, again, the population that we care about measuring, and those are those who are 16 and over and non-institutionalized, right? So with that in mind, again, you divide, to calculate the labor force participation rate, again, you divide it by the population 16 and over. To calculate the employment to population ratio, you divide that by the population 16 and over. To calculate the unemployment rate, you do not, I repeat, you do not divide that by the population 16 and over. You divide that by the civilian labor force. It is an easy mistake to make. It is probably the most common mistake I've seen made when students are trying to answer these questions or do these calculations. None of these calculations are hard if you kind of remember what goes where. So again, just make sure that you remember that to calculate the unemployment rate, you divide that one and that one alone by the civilian labor force. All right. So again, those are some labor market definitions for you to kind of break down how the labor market statistics work. Let's go ahead and go through a quick kind of analysis here. Again, we exit full screen. So when we are trying to figure out how to break down a population into these labor market statistics, then we're going to start off with a total population. We'll call this big I here. So we have the total population of people. So this is all the people around. And we got to figure out which groups these people fit into. Right. So with our total population, right, then you have two groups that we're going to talk about. So we're going to go ahead and call this, say, 1. And these are people who are under the age of 16. And or institutionalized. And again, these are the people that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, when they're calculating out the labor market statistics here, they don't really care so much about measuring these people. Like, we don't really care so much about an 11-year-old, whether he's employed or unemployed or not, right? And then, of course, you've got the second group here, and these are people who are 16 and older. And, of course, non-institutionalized. And I'm not going to focus on the institutionalized part as much as I am the age. But again, when calculating this stuff out, we are focused on those people who are 16 and older. Now, if we're dividing those people who are 16 and older, we're going to divide them up into two groups. So we're going to call these groups A and B. Start using some different colors here. So A here is people who are not in the labor force. Right, so again, we got people who are not in the labor force. Right, with that in mind, again, these could include people like full-time students who are not working. People who are too disabled to work. Again, you got your retirees. You might also include in that your discouraged workers. Anybody not working and not looking for work at the same time, right? And then you also have, call it B here. Actually, I want to do that in a different color. B here, you have people who are in the labor force. and then under the people who are in the labor force, again, you're going to have two groups. Right, you have Group A, which are the people who are employed. Again, these are people who have worked at least some amount in the last week, or if they haven't, it's because they're only on vacation or sick leave. Right, so again, we got working, vacation, or sick leave here, right? And then we have B here. These are the unemployed. And these are people who are not working, but looking for work. All right. So again, those are kind of how the Bureau of Labor Statistics kind of breaks down these different groups. Right. So with that in mind, again, if you're thinking like maybe the total population of people living in Riverside, right, you can break them down into two groups, right? Like people who are, say, not members of the UCR community, and then people who are members of the UCR community. And then you can break down that group even further, the people who are members of the UCR community, right there. And then there are people within UCR, right? Some of them are, say, not on the basketball team, and then some of them are on the basketball team. And then you can break that down further. So the people who are on the basketball team, right, there are people who are out there playing, and there are people who are sitting on their bench waiting for their chance to play, right? Whether they are out there playing or whether they're sitting on the bench and waiting for their chance to play, either way, they are on the basketball team, right? Same thing here, whether somebody is employed or whether they are unemployed, either way, they are still in the labor force. So again, an unemployed person is somebody still in the labor force, even though they're not currently working, because they're kind of waiting for their chance to work, right? So again, be able to understand these labor market definitions and who gets counted and who doesn't, because we're going to go through an example here that's going to show you how this might appear on an exam and the kind of calculations you might have to do. All right. But before we get to that example, let's go ahead and talk about some more statistics that are out there. Again, if you Google search the Fred graph, this comes from the Federal Reserve. You can actually look at these statistics yourself. But if you're looking at what's happening to the labor force participation rate of men and women, you're going to see that over the years, the labor force participation rate of men as a percentage has fallen, while the labor force participation rate of women as a percentage has risen, right? So as women are getting more and more involved in the labor force, that gap gets smaller and smaller. And I imagine will continue to do so as time goes on. Interesting enough, if you look at shifts in educational attainment by gender, you're going to notice that now you have a higher percentage of degrees, no matter what kind of degree we're talking about, being achieved by females versus males, right? So for example, if you're looking at an associate's or 2 years degree, which is that yellow line, you're going to see that about it looks like 62% of those degrees are earned by women, indicating that only 38% are earned by men. Right. If you're looking at a master's degree, you can see that by the 2009-2010 period, about 60% of those are earned by women, and again, only about 40% would be earned by men. Right. If you are looking at a bachelor's degree, again, you're going to see a majority of those are also earned by females than by males. If we ever get back into the classroom, right, if you look around your classroom, you're probably going to see more females than males in your classroom. So with that in mind, you've kind of been witnessing this shift in educational attainment by gender. This is data from 1970 to 2011. If you want to look at more recent or current data, right, so comparing, say, 2000 versus 2018, you can see that even more so in 2018 versus the year 2000, you're going to notice that females are dominating males in educational attainment. So, for example, 89% of females were getting a high school degree in 2000 compared to only 87% of males. In 2018 is 94% of females compared to 92% of males. Right. Again, if you're looking at the associate's or higher degree, you're going to see that, again, in 2000, it was about 40% of females got that degree, whereas 35% of males did. Right. In 2018, you're going to see that it's 52% of females versus 42% of males. right? So again, and looking at the associate degree or higher, it looks like not only are females beating males, but that gap has seemed to have grown in recent years. Speaking of other gaps that have grown, if you take a look at a bachelor's degree or higher, again, 30% of females were getting a bachelor's degree in the year 2000 compared to 28% of males. In the year 2018, it is 41% females and 33% males. So again, not only are women getting bachelor's degrees more than males are, right, but the differences in percentages have grown from the year 2000 to the year 2018. And the same story is true for a master's degree or higher, right? Again, women were slightly outpacing men in the year 2000, 6% to 5%, right? But if you're looking at the year 2018, you're going to see that women, about 11%, are getting a master's or doctorate degree, whereas with males, it's only 7%, right? So again, not only are they still outpacing males, but by a wider margin, right? There's been a lot of guesses as to why this might be true. Some people might think it has a shift. It's a result of a shift in family dynamics. The absence of a father in the family tends to hit sons harder than it hits daughters. So the gap in educational attainment between women and men, it could be wider, with men being farther behind, as maybe fathers are more absent, or you're more likely to have a single parent home. I don't know if I necessarily buy that one as much, although it could be true. I think number two might also be more likely, and that is changing priorities. And that's the idea that, generally speaking, earlier in our history, men were the primary breadwinners, meaning that men were the ones who are going to be likely having the careers and doing things like bringing home the paychecks. And then that way, the man's job or career was an important part of their identity and was an important part of attracting females. Whereas now that females are entering the workplace and bringing home as much or more money themselves than men are, right, or getting these better degrees, now it's not as important for men to get degrees to attract females, since females are able to earn their own money. So again, it's just not as big of a priority for males as it was in the past, right? So that might be a couple potential explanations, or at least ones that have been posited by social scientists, as to why this educational gap seems to be getting wider, right? So with that in mind, just understand that women are dominating the game right now in terms of education, and could be dominating the game in terms of future labor force participation as well. All right, so the last thing we're going to do in this lecture video is calculate out these labor market definitions that we just talked about. So with that in mind, whenever you see these kinds of problems in a textbook, they always talk about a place called like Econland or Econville, or whatever kind of fictional place they want to come up with. And those all sound like boring places to live. Even for me, who has devoted my life to economics, I don't think I'd want to live in like Econland or Econville. So I scoured my 90s rap collection in order to figure out a place that I would want to live, and I found one. If I were one to make up a fictitious city to do this study with, or this example with, I would definitely choose Nellyville, right? If you want to know why, just listen to the lyrics.
Welcome to Nellyville, where all newborns get a half a meal. Son gets a Danville, soon as they can reach the wheel. And all this time is the size of the egg. Yeah, 1 year get 1 curd, 2 years get 2 curds, 3 years get 3 curds, so on into merge. Nobody living average, everybody jangle man. Nobody living savage, everybody got change. Even the paper boy live out the back of a ring.
That looks like a place I want to live. So let's do some examples regarding Nellyville. So let's say these are the statistics in Nellyville. Let's say the total population is 150, but only 2/3 of these people are 16 or older. Let's say that 20 people in Nellyville are full-time students who are so busy being students that they're not looking for work. Let's say that there are 40 people employed. There are 20 people who are retired, so therefore they're not working or looking for work. There are 5 homemakers, and a homemaker is not a person building a home. A homemaker is the name of a full-time stay-at-home mom or dad, right? So somebody who's, again, staying at home and watching their children rather than out there looking for work or working. And then we have 15 people left who are not working, only 10 of which have been looking for jobs, right? So given those statistics, let's go ahead and calculate out those labor market definitions, right? So the first thing we need to do is figure out the total population that we care about measuring. And again, that's that population that is 16 and over. And again, non-institutionalized, but of course, there can't be any institutionalized people in a utopia like Nellyville. Right, so population 16 and over, we have a total population of 150. Again, 2/3 are 16 or older, so 100 is 2/3 of that 150. Again, that's the population that we care about measuring. Now, we also need to figure out who's employed in Nellyville and then who is unemployed. Now we know that there are 40 people employed because it tells us that right there in the statistics. The tricky part might be figuring out who's unemployed. Again, if we got full-time students who are not looking for work, right, those people would not be considered unemployed. Even if they're not working, they're not looking for work, so they're not in the labor force at all. Those 20 people who are retired, again, they aren't working and they aren't looking for work either. Neither are those full-time stay-at-home moms and dads. Right, so we got 15 people who are not working, 5 of which have not been looking for work, so they don't count as unemployed either. Right, again, you have to be not working but looking for work to be counted as unemployed. So only 10 of those 15 have been out there looking for jobs. So again, only 10 of those individuals there would actually be considered unemployed. Right. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and calculate out these labor market definitions. So remember, the civilian labor force is equal to your employed plus your unemployed. So in this case, that's going to be the 40 people who are employed plus the 10 people who are unemployed. 50 is that civilian labor force, right? Now, if we wanted to calculate out that civilian labor force participation rate, for some reason it's not letting me write, there it is. That is equal to the number of people in that civilian labor force divided by, again, the population, 16 and over. And if we want to calculate that out, we certainly could. The civilian labor force, we just calculated out as 50. And then the population 16 and over is 100. So 50 over 100 is 50%. That is your labor force participation rate. If we want to calculate out the unemployment rate, we know how to do that. That is the number of people who are unemployed divided by, again, the civilian labor force. Don't divide that one by the population. That's the most common mistake made on this particular type of problem. Right, so we know who's unemployed, right? That is the 10 people. We know what the civilian labor force is, right? That is a total of 50. So 10 divided by 50, or 1/5, is 20%, which is a high unemployment rate. But as the lyric suggested, all newborns get $500,000, so that might help explain why that unemployment is so high. And then the final thing that we're going to calculate is that employment to population ratio, which again I think is the easiest to remember the formula because it's right there in the name. And that is equal to the number of people who are employed divided by that population. Again, 16 and over are the ones that we care about measuring. And we know that we have 40 people who are employed. We also know that we have 100 people in that population, 16 and over. So that employment to population ratio is 40%. So again, that is how you calculate the labor market definitions. Be able to do an example like that on the quiz or exam if I were to give you one. The hardest part is just figuring out who's employed and who's unemployed. Right? Once you get these three numbers up here, the rest of it is just plugging into some pretty simple or easy equations. Again, just make sure you memorize what those equations are. Make sure when you're calculating the unemployment rate that you divide that one by the civilian labor force and not the population 16 and over. All right, that is it for part 1 of chapter 8. I look forward to talking to you all again for part 2. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. Again, if you have any questions or if there's anything you don't understand, feel free to shoot me an email or come visit me in those Zoom office hours. All right, until next time, just let me know if you need anything. Take care.